Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Ray Chapman is a name probably familiar to a lot of baseball fans, but not for a reason anyone would want to be known for. On August 16th, 1920, at the Polo Grounds, Chapman was hit in the head by a pitch thrown by Yankees pitcher Carl Mays, becoming the only player to die from an injury in a major league game. But Chapman was a terrific player and lived a fascinating life before he died at age 29. Scott H. Longert's book, Love and Loss, The Short Life of Ray Chapman, uncovers the story of the unluckiest man on the face of the earth. It's a great read, and it was a pleasure to talk to Scott. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Scott. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on.
My pleasure. I always like to start these by asking the authors, where does this idea originate for you?
Actually, this idea has been kind of cooking in my head for probably about 20 years, because most of my writings are about Cleveland baseball teams, about eras from the 20s to the 30s and 30s to the 40s and up to 1949. But in the back of my mind, I've always been thinking about Chapman. You're probably familiar with the book, The Pitch That Killed, by Mike Sowell back in the 80s. That was about Ray and Mays and the 1920 World Series. I'd always thought about that. What if there was something, just a book about Chapman alone, about his life? Because I think that a lot of baseball fans, if you ask them who was Ray Chapman, they know that's the guy that got killed by the pitched ball. But other than that, and that he played shortstop for Cleveland, I'm not sure that many people really know about his life. He had an extraordinary life, and that's what I was trying to do when I was thinking about it.
Yeah, so as you say, I think I would assume most people listening to this probably know about the end of his life. What was the beginning of his life like?
Well, he was kind of something that you would think about in kind of the American dream. He was born in a very small town outside of Beaver Dam, Kentucky. His father and his brother were coal miners, so there really wasn't much opportunity at all. Ray was destined for the coal mines, but he was very bright. And at an early age, he showed a lot of ability to play baseball, and that really helped him move along and stay out of the coal mines. I believe he was there briefly, but basically to play for local teams, work his way up to semi-pro, and get his way all the way up to the major leagues. But he came from like an area where where is that? And there was I think at the time of his birth, there might have been 200 residents in the town. So for him to make it from there all the way to Cleveland, to the big leagues, and to be one of the top shortstops, that was extremely difficult. But I really enjoyed reading about, doing the research, how he rose from the small beginnings and made himself somebody really important in American life.
Yeah. So 1912, he comes up with Cleveland. What kind of player is he? How would you describe Ray Chapman, the player?
In 1912, still an unfinished product. He had shown ability to hit. He was a tremendous base runner and a base stealer. And he was a gifted shortstop. He had a great throwing arm. He had a lot of range, but he tended to throw the ball away. He made a lot of errors in the minor leagues. And when he came up to Cleveland from Toledo, he still had some problems throwing the ball. He would go deep in the hole and rifle the ball to first for a great play. Then a routine ground ball, he'd pick it up on the second hop and he'd throw it over the first baseman's head. That's what he needed to work on and what the team had to work with him. And of course, he had some difficulty hitting going on. But when the team got him, he had the potential to be the great shortstop that they've been lacking really since the beginning of the franchise, going back to 1901. He was the guy that was going to finally solidify the position. And he did that, and even more so as he got older.
Yeah, so he actually ends up being a pretty productive, if not a star in the league. I was fascinated that he's known for his sack bunting ability, walks a lot. He stole 50 bases, which I think was a team record for decades.
Yes.
So he ends up actually having a pretty notable career here.
He really did. In the newspapers at the time and the magazines, the articles were mentioned. He was considered one of the best shortstops in the game, or possibly the best in the American League. And Wagner was coming at the end of his career back in Pittsburgh. But he was considered as one of the top shortstops. He was named on some annual all-star teams. He went on the All-America Tour in 1914. He was chosen to be the shortstop for the American League. And many newspapers, especially around 1918, 19, and 1920, were talking as Ray the best shortstop in the game. I guess in today's terms, he'd be something like an Omar Vizquel, that there wasn't a play he couldn't make. He'd go over second base, deep in the hole. And what he was really known for, he could go very far into left field to catch a ball that was in no man's land. He could go down the line. He could go into left center. He had a great ability to take off and get to the right spot and then throw a bullet from there right to second base. In his time, it developed, but I think late in his career, he was regarded as the best shortstop around.
Well, especially you think about baseball in the 19 teens. It was not, the power game that we see today. It is so much more dependent on being able to field and range and getting ground balls. And it sounds like he really was, up there amongst the greats at that time.
Yeah, I think he was. His hitting developed, so he was, by the time of around 1918 or so, when he was 27, he was a 300 hitter. He being batting second, the team had the option of the leadoff guy, which originally was Jack Rainey, then it was Charlie Jameson. If they got a base hit, he'd move him to second, and he rarely missed. He was a tremendous bunter. He could drop it down the third base line and beat it out for a hit, or bunt towards first to move the guy over to second, or the guy in second over to third. If nobody was on base, he'd swing away, and he was a good hitter, could hit the ball to right field, get on base. And then you had Tris Speaker coming up, and then Elmer Smith, who was a pretty good RBI guy back in that day, and Larry Gardner batting fifth. The likelihood of him scoring was pretty high. He was scoring well over 100 runs late in his career, and I think had he continued, he probably would have racked up about another 500 or 600 runs scored, just based on his ability to get to first, steal second, and a base hit. He would come home. He was fearless about that. Even on a base hit to short left field, more than often he'd round third and he'd challenge the outfielder to throw him out. And generally they didn't. They would get a little nervous because they knew Chapman was tough to get out. They'd fire the ball in the dirt at home or throw it away. So he was terrific on the bases and really developed in all those areas. So by 1919 and 1920, 300 hitter, scoring 120, 130 runs, getting 170 hits a year, 55 sacrifice bunts, and moving runners along. He was a complete ball player then, and a great guy to play with, a great teammate. Was very supportive of his teammates, always the first guy out of the dugout to congratulate the guy that hit the home run. So he was really, personally and on the field, really one of the greats. I do believe that.
You kind of jumped into my next question here. He did have this kind of fascinating life. What was Ray the person like?
Ray was a terrific personality, very outgoing. He made friends everywhere he met. He was someone that always was smiling, cracking a joke. He was great at tall tales, which were popular then. You'd sit down and you'd tell this tale that had a little bit of truth to it, but not quite. It'll be a very funny story, and people loved to hear those. And Ray just picked them up from wherever. So the team would sit around a group, and Ray would say, "I got a story for you." And everyone, "Oh, here it goes." And the newspaper reporters would get their pencils out because it would be in the next day's papers. He just really was a guy that kind of shined when you walk into a room. He was kind of a guy people's heads turned, and he had that ability just to make friends, to put people at ease, and always had your back. He was a very supportive guy, no matter what was going on, and that took him a long, long ways. People like go, "Gee, I wish I could be Chappie's friend," or "I want to be friends with Ray Chapman." He was very close with Tris Speaker. The two of them were real best friends. Best friend 1A was probably Jack Rainey. 1B was Steve O'Neill. These guys were always together. And Joe Wood, when he came to Cleveland from Boston, were big time friends. And Ray, the newspaper reporters really, really loved him because they'd always get a quote. No matter if he had a terrible day, he'd still be available to say something to the reporters and would never snap at them, which the reporters and other people really appreciated. So not to try and make him like he was perfect. He had a temper from time to time, but he had that engaging personality that really won over people, and that really jumped him up in status. He was born in a small town, really with nothing at all. And by the time he was 27, 28 years old, he was hanging around with politicians and well-to-do people. They wanted to be his friend too. So he really had a lot going for him.
I believe even Ty Cobb was a friend or considered him a friend.
I'm not sure but I know they got along. Ray would talk to Ty and vice versa. When Ray was killed, the Detroit Tigers submitted a petition to have Carl Mays banned from baseball. I know Cobb was behind it. Part of it was Cobb and Mays had a falling out a couple of years before on an inside pitch, and Cobb trying to charge the mound. So that had something to do with it. But I think the other part was Cobb felt for Chapman very much, and he pushed that petition and got that to the American League president. Didn't go anywhere, but it showed how much that he did care for Ray, and the whole Detroit team had some feelings for Ray.
As we've talked about, he does have this great life. He marries into society a little bit. So talk about a little bit about the relationship between Kathleen Daly, his wife, and Ray. I loved reading about that. It just made him seem like a real person.
Ray hit the jackpot. He fell for, and she fell for him, one of the richest women in Cleveland through her father, who was president of East Ohio Gas Company. He was extremely wealthy. He had stocks and bonds everywhere, was one of the most noted guys in Cleveland, and that made Kathleen, or Katie, it gave her tremendous status. And as her part, she would do what a rich society person would do. She was heading a lot of charities, going to charity functions and donating money. In World War I, she worked very hard in a canteen, serving food to soldiers and dancing and doing all kinds of things with them. She was always out and about, and the newspapers wrote about her quite a bit in the society columns. I mean, if there was an event and Katie Daly was attending, you knew it was going to be successful. She had gone to private school. She went to Catholic school, and she really was educated and was a very bright woman, very pretty, very kind of tall and athletic. I'm not sure who fell for who first, but she saw Ray play a lot because her dad had season tickets and he would take her there a lot. So I don't know which one, but as soon as they were introduced, it seemed like they were perfect for each other. And I think as they went along, Ray was her rock. He was the guy she could go to whenever she had a problem or anything going on. She knew she had Ray behind her, and that really helped her a lot. That did show after he died how she really collapsed and really never recovered from it. So his rise there really was something. He was very good with his father-in-law, Martin Daly, and Martin helped him get started in business. In the off season, he was secretary treasurer of a large manufacturing company. So Ray was set with a very nice salary and stock options and a very rich father-in-law and wife. He had it made for the rest of his life, but unfortunately, he was gone at 29 and never got to fulfill these things.
Yeah, it really is a tragedy. And reading the book, you really learn a lot about. I didn't know that she was pregnant.
Yes. The first child was on the way, and Ray was ecstatic. He wanted a family. They had a brand new house being built for them as a wedding gift from his father-in-law and mother-in-law in a nice neighborhood with 4 or 5 bedrooms and lots of space. Ray wanted a big family, and so did Katie. They would just be celebrated having their kids around and having this great life. So he was very excited going off to New York in August of 1920. The new house nearly ready to move into. Katie about 4.5 months pregnant. Everything was perfect. And the team was fighting for the pennant. Ray had been waiting for this for 7 years, and now they were right in the hunt, and they were the favorite team to pull it off. They had some games coming with the Yankees and in Chicago, but it looked great. So Ray was at the top of his world. He was hitting on all cylinders. Everything was perfect. But then on a day at the Polo Grounds, it all ended suddenly.
Ray really did seem to be really enjoying his life at this point. At age 29, things are going very well. He even mentions possibility of retiring. And then, August 16th, 1920, they're playing the Yankees at the Polo Grounds. Cleveland's having a great year, as you mentioned. They're in the hunt. What can you say about that 1920 Cleveland Indians team?
It was one of the best, I would say, Indian teams of all time. We've had great teams in the 90s and early 2000s, but I think this was really one of the tremendous teams. You have Hall of Famers there in Tris Speaker and Stan Kovaleski, and unfortunately, after Ray died, Joe Sewell filled in, and he would become a Hall of Famer as well. So they had a tremendous ball club with great hitting, great pitching. I think at one point, 7 of the starters were hitting over 300. Speaker was close to 400. Everybody was leading in all categories. Other than Babe Ruth, Elmer Smith was about the premier home run hitter at the time, so he was having a great season. Larry Gardner would knock in well over 100 runs. Everybody was doing terrific. Ray was hitting over 300. He was runs scored. He was only behind Babe Ruth and Speaker. So, I mean, those two guys are super. Ray was right behind them in that category. And He was a little behind, but he probably was going to lead the league again in sacrifice bunts. So yeah, that was a tremendous team. Jim Bagby had an unbelievable career season, 31 wins. Kovaleski was tremendous. And Duster Males came from the Pacific Coast League down the stretch who needed help and won 6 straight ball games. And Ray Caldwell was pretty steady all the time until the World Series. So they had everything you could look at a great team: hitting, pitching, fielding. And the newspapers and everyone was saying Cleveland's going to win it. And they eventually did. They somehow survived after Ray died. It took them a while. They really went on a skid for 6 or 7 games, but fortunately, the Yankees didn't take advantage of it. Neither did Chicago. They played mediocre, and Cleveland was able to right themselves and get back in the hunt and pull it off and go on to the World Series and win that one as well, winning 4 straight in Cleveland. It was a banner year for the team, but unfortunately there's an asterisk as one guy didn't make it, and the guys never forgot that. And as happy as they were to win a World Series, there was a little bit of disappointment in their heads that Ray isn't here to see that and take part in it. That was the downside of it. But I think this was, in summary, one of the best teams Cleveland ever had. I think it stacks against any lineup they had in the modern era as well.
I think before we go too much further here, we got to talk a little bit about Carl Mays, because this is, unfortunately, it is central to the story of Ray Chapman. Who was Carl Mays? What kind of a pitcher was he? What was his reputation?
Carl did have a reputation as a headhunter because he hit guys, but a lot of times he went right for the head. Guys got hit in the head, or they ducked and it glanced off their head, or it just missed. But he had that reputation. And back with the old Red Sox, when he pitched there, he and another pitcher, Dutch Leonard, were known for throwing at guys. It was pretty obvious. And I think their manager, Bill Kerrigan, was all pro hitting guys. So there was a lot of that going on. And Mays had the bad reputation as that. I think part of it came from he threw sidearm. They would say his knuckles would scrape the ground. How does the ball rise from there to a guy's head? It doesn't make sense unless you were looking to scare somebody or move them away. Now, and I never really was able to find any kind of interviews with Mays. Other ones written in the papers that, he did talk a lot in the papers about it. But what happened with Chapman was, I think it was a lot of things combined. You got a pitcher that didn't mind to throw the ball inside. You have a day where it's raining, it's dark, it's damp. The umpires didn't want to switch balls unless they were in terrible shape. She had all these forces coming in. And Ray was someone that liked to crowd the plate a bit, Mays pitching. And unfortunately, the ball came inside and it got him right in the left temple, fractured his skull, and he would die about 6 or 7 hours later. I think Mays was a good pitcher. He won 20 games. He almost has Hall of Fame numbers, but because of what happened, he is never going in the Hall of Fame. Guys will never forget him back till they passed away in the 50s and 60s. And I think modern people won't even consider him based on that. And there's no way to really look into it. But it was a sad day. Mays did say later he wanted to go visit Katie Chapman and offer his apologies, but the Yankee owners told him to stay away. And the thing, too, that I think got me was he never showed any remorse. He never came out and said, I am so sorry what happened. He never sent a telegram to Katie or her family or the Chapmans, or even to the Jim Dunn, the owner of the team, saying, I'm so sorry, send my forgiveness. It was one of those things. He didn't do that. If he had, he might have been forgiven somewhat. But the great example is the St. Louis Cardinals, or not the Cardinals, but the Browns, were talking about signing a petition and sending it in. They didn't do it. But a writer for the St. Louis paper said, if a telegram had come to the guys and said Ray Chapman was killed by a pitch ball to a man, they would have guessed it was Carl Mays. And I think that says it all, that his reputation and the way he threw the baseball, that it was a sad event, but I'm a little biased, and I think that ball was a little bit inside to move Chapman away from the plate. I think that part was intentional. Whether he was hitting him or not, only Mays knows what was going on. But it was the guy who had the bad reputation, so he never lived it down.
When you read about the event, it almost sounds like Chapman doesn't move. He doesn't quite see the ball, or he doesn't expect it to come up on him. But it sounds like he almost kind of freezes. There is a world, I suppose, where he steps back or he falls to the ground or something when he avoids us. Do you have any feel for what actually happens in that moment?
I think it was simply a matter of Ray in his career, I'm sure, had ducked out of the way of balls at his head, had dove forward, had ducked down. But in this case, I think his eyesight wasn't good in the fact that conditions weren't good. You couldn't see the ball that clearly, number one. And I think number two, I had read that the first baseman, Wally Pipp, had said on the Rays' last time out, Mays had struck him out on an outside curveball. So he thought Ray might have been looking for a curveball. He wasn't looking for a fastball inside. So in that millionth of a second, he was thinking move a little bit to your right, and the ball was coming right at him. He didn't have time to move. Another millisecond, he might have moved his head. But I think that was the thing. He was looking for a curveball, and he got crossed up, and he could not move and get out of the way. And it was just one of those circumstances, and he unfortunately didn't recover. The doctors tried their best to save him, did everything they could do with 1920 technology, but it wasn't enough, and he was lost. But in all respects, I guess you could say in one simple sentence, he did freeze.
This is obviously a very traumatic event and big news around baseball, but there aren't necessarily major changes that come from this right away. Batting helmets aren't mandated for, almost 30, 40 years after that. Does anything change because of this event?
Actually, not at all. In the days afterward, the papers were filled with there should be protective gear for ball players. It was talked about for a week or two. Then the way baseball was, it just died away. And I think the ball players, the batters still had that attitude of like, that's part of the game. If they're going to throw at me, I can get out of the way. I think batters would then say, I'm not going to wear anything. I'm wearing my cap and that's it. I'm not wearing anything protective. And it just died away after a few weeks. It would come back in the late 30s when Mickey Cochran was hit in the same area and he nearly died. He was in the hospital for probably about a week or even more, and it was touch and go. And the talk came again, these guys have to wear batting helmets, something or other, and people were talking, and it still didn't happen. So I think at the time, a little bit later, a couple of Dodgers had about 3 or 4 concussions from getting hit in the head. They came up with, or someone in LA or somewhere, a cap that had some metal in it to try and protect your head. And I think it may have been Pete Reiser who wore it, and a couple other guys in Brooklyn, I should say. But I don't think anybody else really got around to it till the 1950s, when I guess guys would get hit and more people talked, and the different generation thought, well, maybe a helmet wouldn't be so bad. I can do it. Yeah, and they wound up doing it. But for the players' sake, they probably should have started wearing something, because other guys would get hit and they would have tremendous repercussions. They didn't die, but they would be out of baseball for a month or more at a time. They needed protection. I think the guys were too macho to do that, at least for another 30 years or so.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember when hockey players still weren't wearing helmets. In the 90s, it took a long time for these macho guys to admit that, like, hey, maybe it's not a bad idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the immediate aftermath, first of all, Mays stays in the game. I don't think that he has any sense of what really happened. I mean, clearly something bad happened. I don't think that he immediately thought that he was not going to make it. And I think that's probably the general reaction at the game. But obviously he dies within a day. How does this Cleveland team react to this?
I think most of them were in shock and disbelief. Yeah. They could not. They all went to the hospital and stayed till about, I think, 11 or 12. And nobody really knew at the time. Ray had surgery, so they were waiting on that. And Speaker, I think, sent them all home. Speaker stayed all night. He told the guys to go home, get rest for tomorrow, and I'll fill you in the morning. And so they all went home to the hotel, went to sleep, and Speaker was waiting for them probably about 7 in the morning and told them that Ray was gone. I think the guys were shocked, and there was a lot of anger. I truly believe Steve O'Neill, if he had the chance, would have probably beat Mays to a pulp. He was furious. From what I read in some stories in the paper, they had to lock him in his hotel room from the outside because all he wanted to do was kill Mays. And he was like a boxer, wrestler, a real tough guy. He probably would have followed through. Jack Rainey was very, very upset about it. It was a very close friend and roommate till Ray got married. Rainey was furious and angry. And Joe Wood was another, I think, who was somebody who was ready to retaliate. And Doc Johnston was in that camp. The other guys were just in shock, and it showed in their play. They had the day off the next day because the game was canceled, but they went and had a doubleheader on a Saturday in Boston. I think they had 3 hits in 2 games. They got shut out in both games. It was obvious these guys weren't ready to play ball. They were just heartsick. But somehow they got it together after about a week. 10 days. I think the home fans helped them when they finally came home. They lost to Detroit, but the fans gave everybody standing ovations and cheered for them the entire game, no matter what they did. And I think it got to the players that the fans are behind us. We still have games to play. We still can win the pennant. And the other thing was Ray would not want us to lay down. He'd be yelling at us right now if he was here. So let's win it for Ray. And I think that helped them all. Like, he'd won a World Series. Let's do it for him. And they did it successfully and did astounding things in the World Series.
How is Ray initially remembered in Cleveland, and how is he remembered now around there?
At the time, I think you could call him an idol. That's how much the fans worshipped him, and people all around the country. So he was revered. People were very, very on his side all the time, and really enjoyed watching him play or reading about him and what he had accomplished. Back home in Heron, Illinois, before he got married, he was the toast of the town. And Owensboro, Kentucky, where his uncle lived, he would go there, and everybody would come to see him and just shake his hand and want to be around him. So I believe he was revered by everyone. They really put him up on a pedestal. The funeral, there was something around 5,000 people trying to get into the chapel, which they couldn't. They lined the steps in like 5 deep, so there was hardly enough room to bring the casket up into the home. People were lined up across the street. Little boys who idolized him were all there with their little caps off, And so it was really it was something that captivated people, not just in Cleveland, but all around the country. They carried the funeral story in all the newspapers everywhere. And then a bit later on, they did a memorial for Ray at a ball game later on. And I think it carried on. But I think once the World Series was over and people had to get on with their lives, and I think, Ray started to fade a bit to the background. And I think that at that point it was starting to be, other than the immediate family and guys, Major League Baseball, people would just remember Ray is a great guy, a terrific shortstop, but they would kind of move on with their lives. And, obviously the Dailies and the Chapman families had a real rough time moving on. And to play, I think Graney and Steve O'Neill never forgot. In their dying days, I think Jack Graney never forgave Carl Mays because some 50 years later, and I think O'Neill was the same, and Joe Wood. I believe there's some tapes of Wood being interviewed, and some things were edited out. I heard the initial thing, but I think he was saying on there that Mays did it on purpose. I know he did it on purpose. So there were some guys that never got past it. And I think Speaker, too, carried it with him for the rest of his life about what happened to his best friend there. So it had an impact. Today, it's kind of like people write into the newspaper, has there ever been anyone killed by a pitch in Major League Baseball? And then there'll be an answer. Yes, there was Ray Chapman. And on the anniversary of his death, some people write some little stories here and there, little notes about it. But today, I think, again, people know a little bit about him, but that's about the extent today. I'm glad he's in the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame, which is nice. And Guardians, I should say, Guardians Hall of Fame. He was elected there in 2006 when they brought back the Hall of Fame. He was in the first group with Addie Joss and several, Rocky Colavito, and I believe Herb Score as well. So Ray is remembered. His plaque that was dedicated in 1920 is at Progressive Field, so everybody can see it. If they look at the Indians or Guardians Hall of Fame and the outfield, they will walk by Ray's plaque, and if they read it, they'll know, this was some guy. But I think that's how it is in time. It happens 10, 20 years later. You kind of move on to other things, and you're not as remembered as well, which is sad because he's on my mind a lot, and I think a lot about him and what he could have accomplished. But I think that's the extent of it today.
Well, that was sort of my next question: is how should we remember Ray Chapman?
I think really as a terrific ball player, a terrific husband, and a terrific friend. Someone who had a real heart. He did enlist in the Naval Reserves in World War I. He was ready to go overseas and fight and do his duty. He was really a model human being, I think. Somebody who would be great to be alive today. He probably would be involved in a lot of social causes, as would his wife. They would be out there saying things about what we need to do and how we need to do it. I think he just was really one of those rare individuals that comes along once in a generation that can really be capable of doing a lot of things and influencing and helping a lot of people. But he didn't get a big chance to do it, only in 29 years. I think had he lived, he would have had his job. I think he could have been mayor of Cleveland, probably by acclamation. I'm sure he could have gone to Congress if he wanted to as well. He was that popular, and his career would have been very successful if he decided to stay in baseball. He was at his peak. He probably had a good 3-4 more years of top flight baseball, which would have put him way up there in stats. And I think he would have had a shot at the Hall of Fame then. I really do. And people would know him a lot better today. But, great ball player. I think really at the top, a great human being. That's who he was.
Mm-hmm. Are there any surviving relatives? Were you able to get in touch with the family at all?
There are some cousins on both sides of the family. However, they don't have much knowledge of Ray or even his wife, Katie, because of the circumstances, the way I understood it. Ray passed away, was devastating to both families. 8 years later, Katie would commit suicide. She just couldn't cope. And then his daughter would die a year later of meningitis. And the family were just so, the tragedy was just too much. I think they just decided not to talk about them. So I know that I talked to a granddaughter of Katie's youngest sister, who's living in the Midwest, and she said if she talked to her grandmother, she'd say, like, "What was Ray like?" And she'd say, "Oh, he was a fine gentleman." "What was Katie like?" "Oh, she was very nice." That's all you could get out of the. Nobody would talk. As went on and on through the years, the Chapman family itself, they didn't speak much about it. Margaret Chapman, his youngest sister, did on a video, which never made, I think was intended to be on the air. It's about 45 minutes. She talks all about Ray, and I think that's the best info you could get about his life and what he did. But that's all about most when he was a child and he was younger, and she remembered him back in Heron and a few times in the major leagues when he was older. She would come up and visit him. But other than that, and there's some cousins on the Daly side who have some old photos of Katie and her parents. And that's really about it. There are other cousins in Ohio, but again, same scenario. You asked your grandmother, grandfather, what was Ray Chapman like, or what was Katie like? And they would say the same one, like, yeah, they were very nice. And you couldn't get much more. So it's sad because I wanted to try and get more info about him. I was hoping for some letters. He must have sent 100 letters to Katie when he was on the road. She must have written 100 letters to him when they first got together and up to his death. But they're gone. They apparently are gone. Nobody knows anything about him. And the wedding was spectacular in 1919. One of the big weddings at the Daly home, which is kind of like a mansion. Hundreds of people attended. You would think there were hundreds of photographs taken there by the press and by private parties of all of them. And there's only one that appeared in, I think, the Cleveland News. And there had to be, apparently, there was a fire at the Chapman home in the 1930s, and the surviving members think a lot of things were lost, maybe the photos. But on the Daly side, there should have been lots and lots of photos of Katie as a little girl growing up with her and Ray and the family. And there is no indication if they really existed there anywhere. So that's all as far as I could get. I'm hoping that one day I'll get a phone call or email and someone say, I'm a relative that you didn't talk to me, but I've got this photo album or something. I just love to see the photographs or read a letter Ray wrote to Katie or vice versa. But somehow they just don't seem to be on anywhere in the planet.
It is a story worth telling, and in a major part of baseball history that I think is often overlooked, or you get just the quick overview without understanding actually everything that went into it. It's really tragic moment.
Yeah, I can't think of. There's been other people that died in Major League Baseball in accidents in the off season, and a few people that committed suicide along the ways. But something like this, to be hit by a baseball and to die. The other sad part, there's several. He never got to even meet his daughter, which is just horrible. And the fact that Katie was called to come to New York as fast as she could. Ray was hurt. She knew it was serious, but she couldn't get there in time. Train transportation. She got the first train available out of Cleveland. She couldn't get to New York till 10 in the morning, and he died about 5 hours before. She had no chance to say goodbye to her husband, which is just awful and awful. And I think that was the beginning of her downfall, which led to her suicide some 8 years later. Everyone tried to help her, but she just needed Ray with her. She needed to say goodbye to him, and she was deprived of that. And I think the pitch, actually, I say it cost 2 lives. It was Ray, of course, but I think that led to Katie's death as well. I'm very proud of the book. I've written 7, And this is the one I'm most proud of because I'm hoping people will learn about Ray and think, wow, what an interesting guy, what a great guy. And that's what I wanted to accomplish, really. I'm not looking to be on the bestsellers list, whatever. I just would like people to learn about Ray and learn some history about him and about Cleveland and about the United States back at that time. We had a world war going on and we had a pandemic as well. And I think people should learn a little bit more about these things and understand how they affected people back in the 19 teens. And we know how it was a few years ago, but people suffered back then tremendously. And I think it would be great for people to learn more about it. So that's my hope with the book.
That was Scott H. Longert. His book, Love and Loss, The Short Life of Ray Chapman, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,